This is our first part of our section on Shinto. Shinto is the native religion of the island of Japan. And this week we're going to look at what Shinto is and how it has been influenced by Taoism, Confucianism, Buddhism, and the way those religions interact in Japan. I have a quote here that says, "To live free of obstructing mists, problems of the morning should be solved in the morning, and those of the evening should be solved by evening. Wisdom and knowledge should be applied like the sharpness of an axe to the blinding effect of the mists of obstruction. Then may the kami purify the world and free it of tsumi." It's a long quote. It's an interesting quote. It says a lot about Shinto. Let's deconstruct it a little bit. It talks about obstructing mists, right? So obstructing mists are clearly here. They're challenges, they're obstacles, they're things that blind you. How do you free yourself of obstructing mists in your life? You should solve problems of the morning in the morning and problems of the evening in the evening, which kind of implies that there should be sort of order to the way you do things. You should take everything in its place. You should take care of every problem in its place. You take care of things in the morning, things that are of the evening in the evening, right? You don't make breakfast at night, and you don't put the kids to bed in the morning, right? So there's a sense of order here, which should seem familiar by now, because certainly when we looked at Taoism and Confucianism, which began in China, there was a lot of emphasis on order. So here we can see that the Japanese religion, Shinto, also puts a certain emphasis on order and things in their right place. Wisdom and knowledge should be applied like the sharpness of an axe. So here's an emphasis on wisdom and knowledge, which sounds a little bit Buddhist, doesn't it, right? Using wisdom and knowledge to blind the mists of obstruction, right? To destroy these obstacles in your life. But, and this is the crux of the quote, then may the kami purify the world and free it of tsumi. So they talk of order like Taoists and Confucius, they talk of wisdom and knowledge like Buddhists, but what Shinto is interested in ultimately is pleasing the kami, which are the spirits of the world, and purifying the world from tsumi, which are impurities, which is like a sort of spiritual dirtiness. Now, in each religion that we've looked at so far, we've seen that every religion has its own ideal that its followers strive to. So we've talked about in the discussion boards in Christianity, the ideal of Christianity is good as opposed to evil, right? It's goodness and being a good person. As we've seen in Asia, it's not always the case. In Buddhism, there is an ideal of being a good person, but being a good person in Buddhism also means being a self-aware person. In Hinduism, the ideal that all Hindus strive to is dharma, following one's duty. And by doing so, you can be, a good person. But there's not so much the sense of sin as there is in Christianity. Christianity is very focused on this idea of sin, that there is sin in the world, and sin has to do with your actions, and you have to purge yourself into it. Hinduism recognizes sin, but it's not as interested in it. It's more just interested in people following their dharma and doing the right thing, which relates to sin, but they have a little different relationship with it. Buddhism is focused on doing the right thing in so much as you're trying to create merit, destroy karma, and show compassion towards other beings. Taoism is not really interested in the concept of sin or right or wrong. Taoism's ideal is that of harmony. The ideal within Taoism that Taoists strive for is creating harmony in themselves and in their lives, and recognizing harmony around them and learning how to flow with it. Confucianism, the ideal is order. Order and proper relationships between people, and making a society that is harmonious, right? So it's similar to Taoism, but more of a secular theme. Shinto, the ideal is purity. the idea with Shinto is that there are impurities in the world, but to live a good life, right? Be careful, and I should say you have to be careful when you use the word good, because it can mean a lot of different things. We'll talk about that today. In order to live, I guess, maybe a divine life, a proper life, one has to walk in the path of the kami. One has to recognize the spirits of nature, the spirits of nature that are all around us, and commune with them properly. And that through that one can receive blessings and things. And the main way you can reach commune, union with the kami, is by purifying yourself and recognizing the kami where they are. So what does all this mean? That's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about the history of Shinto. We're going to talk about the kami. We're going to talk about Kagara, which is a sort of union with the kami. And we're going to talk about purification and why purity is so important to Shinto. Let's start with some interesting numbers. This is based upon a census of the Japanese people taken within the last 10 years. They say that of the people surveyed, 90% said that they attend family graves annually. It's a Shinto practice as well as a Confucian practice. They have altars at home, so Shintos do. They visit shrines, Shinto shrines, in the first 3 days of the New Year, which is the common festival days there. 60% believe in an unseen power. 50% believe in deities or kami or Buddhas. 30% engage priests, Shinto priests, for purification rituals. But less than 30% of the Japanese people identify with an institutionalized religion. So what that means is that they do all this stuff. The Japanese people do this stuff with their religion, but they don't think of themselves, they don't identify with a religion. They're not likely to say, I am a Buddhist, I am Shinto, I am whatever religion. They're not likely to identify with a religion. And in a few weeks, we're going to look at Judaism, and we're going to see that there are a good number of, there's a large percentage of modern Jewish people who identify with their religion but don't participate. Here, though, we have a religion where people participate, they practice, but they don't identify. There's a wonderful section in your textbook called An Interview with a Japanese Businessman. If you haven't read it, read it. Read it carefully, and if you've read it already, then read it again. I won't go all through it, but in it, this Japanese businessman who's interviewed, I mean, I think he really makes it clear the way Japanese people think of their own religion. You know, he goes to the shrines. He knows that that his grandparents had a Shinto shrine in their home. He doesn't really know what his parents do. You know, like he doesn't. He does it because it's part of his society, right? But he doesn't identify with it, and he believes. You know, he talks about, you know, he thinks that there are some sort of kami or something. He's not positive, but he thinks there are. But he doesn't have this strong identification with the religion. And that is very, very interesting. And I think Shinto, of all of the religions that we're looking at in this class, I think is the least likely to create a strong sense of identity in its practitioners. Certainly there are other religions, a lot of other religions that we're not looking at, we don't have the time to look at. But of the ones that we are looking at, it's the case. So what are the roots of Shinto? So it developed in Japan. It's ancient as the Japanese people itself. It has no real founder. It has no orthodox sacred scripture. It has no 10 Commandments or Eightfold Path, anything like that. It is a tradition. It is a practice that has been passed down, less than a teaching. No explicit ethical code. And the origins of Shinto lie in clans, the ancient clans of Japan, before Japan had like a centralized government or kingdoms or anything. It goes all the way back to these little clans and tribes who worshipped some sort of deity or kami or ancestor, and also worshipped natural forces, the kind of unseen beings and natural forces. You might call them spirits, nature spirits. Both, both in trees and in the earth and water and grass, everywhere. The word Shinto itself means the way of the gods, or the way of the kami, which is kind of, it's a little bit of a vague name, right? There are two major written chronicles of myths. There's no sacred canon, but there are some compendiums of Shinto myths. The Kojiki and the Nihongi. The Kojiki itself I should say both were written kind of later in Japanese history. And the Kojiki in particular is very interested in kind of showing the way that Japan's emperor has, or the emperorship has divine roots. That the emperorship dates all the way back to the sun goddess Amaterasu, which your book explains. Right? So there are two written chronicles. They tell the stories of the gods. This is a beautiful painting here of the story of Amaterasu, the sun goddess, who was angry at some of the other gods, and she hid herself in a cave. And she had to be tricked into coming out of the cave. And when she, because the earth was dying without the sun, right? She's the sun goddess. She hid herself in the cave. Everything on earth started to die. So the other gods had to get together and trick her into coming out. So this is a very famous scene in Japanese myth. Up here is the two gods. The male and female god is literally who they were. And they were two of the older gods, not the first ones, but the older ones, who stirred up the primordial ocean. Right? This was at a time when there was no earth. There was heaven, and there was this sort of like primordial goop, like an ocean or just like kind of a vast nothingness, a void. And they went ahead and they stirred it up. And by stirring it up, they created nature, and they created the different islands of Japan. Eventually, they created the whole earth that way. So these are really famous stories in Shinto. They have been influenced by Buddhism, by Confucianism, Korean, and Chinese thought. As I say, they were written down. The Kojiki Nihongi were put together quite late. So Japan, by that point, had already had a lot of contact with China and Korea in particular, and had been influenced by those ideas. Shinto is very much, you can kind of think of it as sort of a sacred path that guides your life, right? It's recognizing all of the powers around you and showing respect to them. And in that way, it's kind of similar to Taoism in some ways, and yet not at all like Taoism. There is also the sense of having a great kinship with nature. In Taoism, there's more of a sense of kind of manipulating that, manipulating those factors so you can flow with it. Japan, it's more about kinship. It's more about your relationship, your human being's relationship with nature in kind of a familial way, kind of like family. In Japan, natural beauty and symmetry are very important. They're shown a lot in architecture and art. These people still very much organize their lives around the seasons, the way they did in ancient times. Mount Fuji is honored as an embodiment of divine power. This is a really famous wood carving here. It's a wood print, actually. You've probably seen it before. And you have Fuji in the background. You have these great waves, and you have these tiny, tiny fishermen, right? So it's very similar to the painting I showed you, the Chinese painting I showed you of the mountains, and showing how people are kind of very, very tiny in relation to the greatness of nature in the world. So Japan has this idea as well that we're kind of at nature's whims, and we have to be respectful of that. In general, Japanese art goes back to nature a lot. There's another famous painting of a waterfall Here's a famous painting of, this is a very famous one actually, of flowers and a swallow. The Japanese have a great respect for for nature and the beauty in nature and the power in nature. And where does that power come from? From the kami. Now, the book says something really interesting, and I've had students come to me before and kind of argue this point, that for many centuries Japan had no word for nature. I've had students say that can't be possible, especially when you have a religion that where the people are so focused on living in harmony with nature, respecting nature, right? Respecting the spirits of nature. But we've seen before in this class that there are several cultures we've looked at that don't have terms for very important concepts. For example, it's like Hinduism doesn't have a word for religion. Japan apparently didn't have a word for nature. Taoism. The book does a good job of pointing out that in Taoism, there's no really definition for Tao. Tao means way or path. But it's not exactly clear what that means, right? It's something it's a path that you walk, right? So there's clearly this underlying idea that the Tao is trying to get at that isn't very clear. And the fact of the matter is, this is something really common in human civilization and human language. When a culture lacks a certain term, such as nature or religion or anything else, it either means that it doesn't have that concept at all. It's something that the culture hasn't encountered, and so it hasn't needed a word for it. Or it means that the concept is so ingrained in that culture that they don't need a term. That the concept is beyond words, right? And to illustrate that point, think for a moment about the word evil. Evil with a capital E. What does the word evil mean? Evil with a capital E. You're thinking of the Holocaust or other kind of crimes against humanity. Evil. The very essence of malevolence, like a force within the world that seeks to destroy or hurt or harm. You know what evil means, right? Of course you do. It's a very important concept in a Christian culture, in a mostly Christian culture, evil. So then, we know what evil is. What is the opposite of evil? Evil is a very specific thing. What is the opposite of evil? Right? Think of it this way. Blank versus evil. It's a common phrase used. Blank versus evil. If evil is the embodiment of all that is malevolent and destructive and horrible, if it's something really specific, evil, the word we use to describe the opposite is good. Now think about that for a moment. Good. How do you use that word? How often do you use that word in a day? And in how many different ways? You could say, this food tastes good, in which case good means delicious. You could say, oh, he looks good, which in that case good means attractive. You could say, did you see that movie? Yeah, I saw that movie. It was good, which means it was entertaining. I said to you, how are you? And you might say, I'm good, good. Which really just means I'm fine, I'm adequate, I'm not wonderful, it's not the best day of my life, but I'm adequate, right? Good can mean anything from delicious to attractive, to entertaining, to adequate. Good, in many ways, is the most generic word in the English language. It can mean anything. And yet that is the word that we choose to represent this concept of good with a capital G. You have to be a good person, right? The forces of good versus the forces of evil. This is one of the underlying concepts of Western philosophy, that there is such a thing as goodness with a capital G, and there is such a thing as evil, and that the two are at odds with one another. And yet, as important as this concept is, as key it is to our concept of religion and ethics, we don't have a specific word just for that one idea. We don't have a specific word for what we mean when we talk about good with a capital G. We depend on a very generic word that means many, many different things. Just like dharma is this word that means so many things. Like Tao, path, is a word that means so many things. You remember in the first week, we talked about symbols and how the more plain a symbol is, the more meanings it can take on, right? Like the cross, the yin-yang, the very simple symbols that are so complex in meaning. So think of these words: good, dharma, Tao, nature. In these particular cultures, they are these generic, simple symbols for very complicated ideas that are key to understanding their philosophies, their ways of looking at the world. So the fact that Japan didn't have a word for nature for centuries, what does that mean about the way the Japanese saw their natural environment? When an ancient Japanese person walked through the woods or passed a lake or saw a mountain, they didn't really even have a word for it. Think about that. What that means, what nature means to the Japanese people. For them, it was just very much just the world, right? Nature was just the world. It was just what they existed in. Whereas, for example, maybe here in Illinois, you might think of nature as being a very specific thing, something that's outside of the city. It's specifically in specifically things that haven't been touched by people. In Japan, nature is everything. Nature's everywhere, right? And within nature, within the world, there are all of these kami. So what are the kami? I've mentioned this many times now. What are the kami? Kami are basically spirits that have organized the world, that are exist in everything, pretty much in every natural thing. Rocks, each individual rock can have a kami. Trees, an individual tree can have a kami. And then there can be kami that are more like deities, like gods, like the sun goddess, what we think traditionally of as a deity. That's a kami. Down here I have an image from a traditional Japanese folk story. Where this man, he's a famous sorcerer, and he needs some help. And he needs some magical help, so he goes to these three. They're demons, right? The word is translated as demons. He goes for them to help. These are kami, right? This statue here, I've actually seen this statue when I was in Japan. This is one of the huge statues outside of a famous Buddhist temple. He's a guardian. He's a guardian of the Buddhist temple. You can see his hand is up like that, and he has a hand on his hilt, his sword. He's there to protect the temple. He's a kami. This little fox here, whose name is Inari, is a very famous kami who takes the form of foxes, but who can also, and foxes are considered very mischievous in Japanese mythology, so he's kind of mischievous. But he also has the ability to impart blessings to people. So there are some famous shrines to Inari. These are all kami, right? These are all kami. In a way, kami is more of a quality than an actual thing. It's literally means that which is above. So something that's above us, right? We talk about relations to nature. Shinto emphasizes that we are a part of nature. Humanity is a part of nature, but we're also kind of, I don't want to say inferior to it. Maybe inferior to it. At its whim. We are at nature's whim. Like the picture I showed you of the little boats who are being overcome by the waves. Those waves are the kami. Those waves are the world. And we're at the whims of nature. Kami is also a quality that evokes awe and wonder, good or bad, right? Again, this is not an ethical thing. This is not about right and wrong. This is not about good with a capital G and evil with a capital E. That is a Western thing. You really got to push that out of your mind. Those things exist. Those concepts of good and evil exist in Japan. But Shinto, the Shinto Kami, do not fall into those categories. The Kami oftentimes can have personalities and character just like human beings. They're complex, they're kind of good, they're kind of bad, they can be finicky, or they can be kind, or they can be compassionate. They are immanent, which means it's everywhere. The Kami are everywhere, and they are transcendent, which means they are both in the world and they transcend it as well. They are above it, right? They're above this world, and yet they're everywhere in it. And that concept is very common to religions around the world. Oftentimes they reside in very beautiful or very powerful places like Mount Fuji. You know, the famous Mount Fuji. It's the biggest mountain in Japan. It's called, in the Japanese actually call it Lord Fuji, Fuji-sama. They can also appear in sort of abstract forms. Kami can exist in forms of nature and also processes of nature, right? Like reproduction, creativity, you know, the forces of the winds, in death and in life and in change. Kami is present there as well. For the Japanese, the thing is to bring themselves into harmony with Kami, with nature, and to come to commune with it. If you can be in harmony with nature, if you can commune with it, then you've reached what they call Kagara. Kagara can be translated as spontaneous awareness, right? A sudden awareness, a sudden realization. Usually it is not just an awareness, but it's a sensation, it's a feeling of awe and wonder. If you've ever seen a beautiful sunset and it stopped you, and you're just like, wow, that's just amazing. That's Kagara. If you have ever visited the Grand Canyon, or been to the mountains, or looked across Lake Michigan and thought, it's like an ocean, it's huge, look at how big it is. That spontaneous awareness, that sudden feeling of awe, that is Kagara, right? And that's an important part of the way the Japanese then can commune with nature, right? Because first you have to have that sudden awareness. You have to understand how great nature is. When you look at that sunset, when you see that lake or the Grand Canyon or a mountain, or just maybe you just see a beautiful garden. It could be something simple as just a beautiful flower, right? That sudden awareness, it purifies your mind because it clears your head of all these sorts of thoughts. And in that moment of awareness, you can commune. You're communing with the Kami. Your appreciation for the amazingness of the thing you're looking at. That's a sort of appreciation for the Kami, for the spirit of that thing, right? When you look at that sunset and you recognize its beauty, you're sensing the Kami. So that's kind of the heart of Shinto, is stopping and recognizing it, right? Look at this picture here. This rope has these sort of tassels hanging from it. These are Shinto, right? You see these ropes with tassels? Those are Shinto. This is a very old tree, and some Shinto practitioners have recognized that that tree has Kami. Ancient trees or very, very old trees are often honored in Shinto, right? As are very ancient forests. So they mark it off. They mark it off out of reverence. They had a moment of Kagara. They recognized the Kami, and in this way they're respecting it. They're revering it. It's an important part of Shinto. This is a Shinto shrine. As you can see, it's out in nature, right? Shinto shrines are often surrounded by trees and things. Even if you're in a crowded city, right? You can still find places in a Japanese city where a little shrine that's tucked aside, right? And it's protected by trees. It's protected by other sorts of things. Maybe it's in the middle of a large park. Most large parks have shrines in them somewhere, right? Because it's tucked away from things. It's in some place natural. And you can see they mark these trees, right? Sometimes when they tie these papers on, they write wishes. Shinto practitioners will write wishes on them and tie to these branches. And sometimes they're blank and they're just there to recognize the kami of the tree. You can see that they use natural materials. They use wood and stone, and there's no stained glass. There's no, the bright colors of Hindu temples and Taoist temples. There's none of that. There's no statues of kami. They really try to avoid making statues of kami that look like people. Rather, you have to look harder at nature to find the kami. And by finding Kagara, that purifies yourself, right? Again, it comes back to purity. Impurity in Japanese is also the same word for misfortune. Why is purity so important? Because purity also means good fortune. Good fortune means prosperity. It means luckiness. It means happiness. It means all those kinds of good things, right? Impurity is synonymous with misfortune in Shinto. And that can come in the form of misfortune. It can come in the way of wicked spirits, which are like wicked kami, wicked minds, right? Having wrong thoughts. Corpses. There's a great taboo against dead animals in Japan. Even before Japan was largely Buddhist, there was a general dislike of eating meat. And even today, people don't, people treat meat in a very special way. You buy it at the store, it's wrapped up, it's in its plastic, but then they wrap it in paper too, and then they put it in its own separate plastic bag, and then they put it in the grocery bag, right? There's a sense of like you have dead meat, right? You have corpse that you're taking home, and it needs to be separated from the rest of your food. This is true. Menstruation, right? When women are on their periods, they're considered unclean. Pregnancy and birth are considered unclean as well. So both coming into this world in the form of birth and leaving the world in the form of death, that can bring impurity, hostility, and anger, natural catastrophes. One thing about the Japanese people as a whole is they tend to be very even-keeled, even-minded. It's considered a really bad manners to lose your temper in public or to lose your temper at all, right? These things, they're considered very crude, and they're impure in a way. They bring impurity with them. You maintain purity by, living in harmony with nature, by, avoiding these taboos, or these sorts of tsumi. But if you do become impure, which is bound to happen, there are different rituals that they have to purify. And most Shinto rituals are based around the idea of purifying, right? You can go to a Shinto shrine to ask for help, ask the kami for help, but most of the rituals there revolve around impurity. So misogi is probably the most common Shinto ritual. It's ritual washing, right? And you can wash in like a waterfall or in the ocean, or if there are natural springs. There are a lot of Shinto shrines that are built around natural spring, where people can come to wash themselves and purify themselves. There's oharai, which is a ritual where the Shinto priest waves a tree branch, and it has these white streamers on it, and he waves it over you, and it purifies you. Or it can be used on new cars, on new buildings, new businesses, anything that needs an extra blessing, anytime you're starting out on something, Oharai can help you with your endeavor. As we've seen here, there are spirits that are impure. There are Tsumi. There are Tsumi spirits. There are Tsumi kami, right? So purification allows you to connect with the pure kami. Purification allows you to connect with the kami that are clean and bright, right and straight. Those are the ones that you want to be in contact with. You don't want to be in contact with the kami that are called demons. That's the other interesting thing. If you study Shinto more, you'll see that they talk about Shinto gods, Shinto spirits, Shinto demons, Shinto, they translate it all different kinds of ways, like elves or goblins or, this or that, nature spirits, animal spirits. All of these words, though, all of these things, in Japanese, they're just kami. They're all just kami. They're the things that are above, right? And by purifying, you can connect with the ones that are clean and bright and straight, and the ones that will bring fortune to your life. So here are some pictures of some different misogi. This right here is actually at, you'll find this at every Shinto shrine in Japan. It is flowing water. It is not water that is stagnant or not moving. It is water that is constantly flowing. That is pure water. Water that just, stays stagnant like a pond. That's not, that grows bacteria and things. It's clearly not pure. So you'll see this at every Shinto shrine. They'll have something like this, where they have these little bamboo cups, and you take the water and you hold your hand over this opening right here, and you pour the water over your hand, pour your water over the other hand, right? You never wash your hands over this water. This is the common water. That's the pure water, right? It's like if you were taking a bath, you wouldn't, or if you were, I don't know, how would you describe it? This is the pure water, and you don't want to taint it with your impurities. So as you're washing your hands, you wash over this area here that catches the impure water and takes it away. And as I say, this is constantly flowing. That's what you do before you enter any shrine. Now these two are interesting, right? This man is clinging to a block of ice. I've heard of this. I've never seen it when I was in Japan, but I've heard of that, holding on to it for a set amount of time or as long as you can. This is very common, sitting underneath a waterfall. Now look at it, it looks quite painful, to be honest, with the pressure of the water. So there are misogi that emphasize a certain level of physical discomfort. Not hurting yourself, but some physical discomfort. And this kind of comes back to asceticism, right? In Hinduism, you go out and you live in the, yogis go out and they live in the mountains, and they live without much food, and they live without nice things. Or in Taoism as well, there are certain practices that are painful or they're difficult. Why do religions do this, right? Every religion has a little bit of that, and it's asceticism. If you've ever been in pain, if you've ever been in severe pain, you know that when you're uncomfortable or when you're in pain, you can't think of anything else, right? If you've ever broken a finger, you know that that's the only thing you can think about is how much that finger hurts. Or if you've ever been extremely nauseous, like you've had the stomach flu, all you can think of is how sick you feel, right? And in that way, pain and discomfort purify, right? They clear the mind of everything else. So the other side of it is it's also sort of, willingly submitting yourself to this kind of discomfort is kind of a proof of how serious you are. It's a sacrifice. It's an offering in a way. And every religion does it. And in Japan, it comes back to purity. It comes back to purifying yourself. And look at this woman. Maybe it's a man. I'm not sure. It's hard to tell. But look, there's snow here, so it has to be really cold. And what is he holding? Buddhist prayer beads, right? He's meditating as he's doing this Shinto ritual. So you can kind of see how Buddhism and Shinto kind of fit together in some ways, right? Like he's purifying himself, he's clearing his mind, he's meditating, right? He's trying to find awareness. He's trying to find, some sort of enlightenment. And same thing here, he's wearing a prayer bead bracelet. But it doesn't always have to be uncomfortable, right? These people they're just washing their hands. Down here, I like this one. It's just some schoolgirls. They're kind of giggling and laughing, and they're kind of throwing water at each other as well. So Misoki doesn't always have to be miserable, and it's often done in groups together. It's very common for the Japanese people to perform these rituals together. Those are some examples of Misoki. And as I say, this is probably the most common. Oharai. Here's an example right here. It's not the best picture. I admit it's a little bit blurry, but it's so interesting to me. You can see the priest here. He has his tree limb with the paper banners. And look what he's purifying. He's purifying their computers. He's purifying the laptops. Like it's perfectly, it's perfectly acceptable to purify new pieces of machinery to make sure that they don't bring misfortune, that rather that they work well and they help you in your endeavors, right? It's not uncommon to see things like this. It's not uncommon to pay a priest to come into your business and purify a new place. There aren't really Shinto monks or nuns, right? There are Shinto priests and priestesses. The difference is that, monks and nuns are focused on living the right life and just focusing on the right way of living and dedicating themselves to the religion. Priests and priestesses are more interested in being leaders of their community, of being intermediaries between the divine and humanity, and upholding like the laws and the rules of their religion. That's what the priesthood is for. It's different than monkhood, right? So Shinto doesn't have monks, but it does have priests and priestesses. So my question for you is, why is Kagara important in Shinto? It's a very important concept. It relates to the kami, it relates to purity, it relates to nature, right? It encompasses these three really important parts of Shinto. So can you explain a little bit about why it's important to Shinto, about what it does for practitioners of Shinto? In the next lecture, we're going to talk a little bit more about practices and shrines, and in our third lecture, we're going to talk about modern Shinto and politics and things like that. Email me with any questions.